Et un cas frappant qui n'est pas un cas théorique, c'est au Cameroun. Il y a déjà au Cameroun une guerre anglophone peut-être depuis 8 ans. Médecins sans frontières a cessé d'opérer dans cette région parce que le gouvernement l'a accusé d'être trop proche des entités non étatiques, c'est-à-dire les rebelles. Donc, Médecins sans frontières a finalement quitté le Cameroun. Donc, la deuxième logique humanitaire, c'est toujours en relation avec cette guerre anglophone au Cameroun. Pendant la guerre, l'État a fait quelque chose qui était totalement, on n'a jamais vu ça au Cameroun, l'État a lancé une campagne humanitaire pour lever les fonds. Donc, on ne sait pas très bien ce que l'État fait. Et l'État distribue aux déplacés internes. Pendant les fêtes de Noël, l'État va aller leur donner de l'argent. Et on va dire, euh, euh, le président est un père qui n'oublie pas ses enfants. Donc, il y a une logique tellement humanitaire. Mais le dernier point par lequel je vais finir, c'est comment est-ce que l'humanitaire impacte même la définition de l'État en Afrique. Je vais prendre un exemple plutôt fictif. Dans un roman de Mongo Betty, l'État est totalement décrédibilisé. Et pour approcher les populations, l'État envoie des espions qui viennent se faire passer pour les agents des agents humanitaires. Et ils disent aux populations que personne ne peut les toucher et que même la Croix-Rouge va venir intervenir pour eux. Comme vous avez vu, la fiction et la réalité se rencontrent par le fait que au Cameroun, j'ai regardé depuis peut-être 5-10 ans, il y a un discours, l'État se définit à travers une logique humanitaire pour distribuer des fonds publics. Donc voilà.
Merci d'applaudir le professeur Silas Kemejo. Merci beaucoup en tout cas à vous et à nos distingués discutants et à vous, chers participants aussi, pour votre attention et vos interventions tout au long de cette conférence. Votre engagement contribue surtout à la richesse et à la qualité de nos échanges. Juste avant de poursuivre, j'ai 2 petites annonces à vous faire. Si par hasard quelqu'un a oublié sa tablette hier ici, merci de vous rapprocher de l'accueil pour la récupérer. Aussi, si par inadvertance, quelqu'un n'a pas ramené avec lui 2 émetteurs, merci également de les restituer à l'accueil. Nous allons maintenant passer le témoin à Monsieur Ertan Opri, qui prendra en charge les panels suivants et poursuivra l'animation de cette journée riche en réflexions. C'était un plaisir. Merci à tout le monde.
Merci beaucoup, Adja. Merci.
Ertan?
Merci beaucoup, Adja. C'était un petit problème de d'égarement de mes notes. Donc, on va continuer cette matinée avec la dernière conférence de la matinée donc, conférence 6, l'Afrique et ses diasporas, panafricanisme, décolonialité et défis géopolitiques. Donc, pour cette conférence, je vais inviter, s'il vous plaît, à venir me rejoindre sur scène le professeur Faisal Garba, la professeure Akosua Ampofo, professeur Rachid Yassine et Fadiloun Gom, s'il vous plaît. Donc, merci de venir vous asseoir le temps qu'on commence. Il commence à sentir très très bon au fond de la salle, donc encore un ultime instant de patience avant qu'on puisse arriver au repas. Donc on va commencer. Donc je disais conférence numéro 6, l'Afrique et ses diasporas, panafricanisme, décolonialité et défis géopolitiques, qui sont donc trois éléments, donc panafricanisme, décolonialité, défis géopolitiques, trois éléments qui connectent l'Afrique au monde et qui sont centraux dans l'intérêt du LASPAD et de la revue Global Africa. Je ne dis pas ça au hasard, vous allez le voir aussi quand je vais présenter les intervenants. Qui connectent l'Afrique au monde parce que, vous le savez, le panafricanisme est né en dehors du continent au 19e siècle. Donc le panafrique est un élément qui contribue à connecter l'Afrique au reste du monde. On parlait de décolonialité, qui est aussi un paradigme qui est né plutôt en Amérique latine, et défis géopolitiques qui, par nature, sont intercontinentaux. Donc tous ces éléments nous confortent dans l'idée d'une Afrique globale, si vous voulez, qui pour reprendre le titre de notre revue. Et donc tous ces éléments ont une existence historique. Je rappelais la naissance au 19e siècle du panafricanisme. Pareil, la décolonialité, eh bien voilà, c'est un paradigme qui existe depuis plusieurs décennies, et les défis géopolitiques existent dès lors qu'il y a des sociétés humaines qui s'organisent. Donc la question qu'on se pose en fait avec cette conférence, c'est comment se saisir aujourd'hui, actuellement, de ces trois éléments, comment s'en saisir intellectuellement et aussi de manière militante. Et c'est là où je trouve que ce panel, et notamment la composition de ce panel est extrêmement intéressante. Nous avons donc Faisal Garba qui va nous proposer sa keynote. Faisal, professeur Faisal, vous êtes maître de conférence en sociologie à l'université de Cape Town. Vous êtes spécialiste des migrations et de mobilité, et vous avez donc une approche en termes de théorie sociale et de sociologie historique. Donc quand on s'intéresse aux sciences humaines, c'est des termes de théorie sociale, de sociologie historique, ce sont des termes qui résonnent, et donc j'ai hâte d'écouter votre keynote. Une des publications que j'ai relevées vous concernant, c'est un ouvrage que vous aviez coordonné avec Bruno Monteiro, Maids and Masons, Class, Gender, Ethnicity in Migrant Experience, en 2018, mais surtout, vous avez coordonné le numéro 4 de Global Africa, Ghana Must Go, ce qui était en 2023, et que je vous invite d'ailleurs à consulter. C'est un numéro qui est disponible en ligne, ne serait-ce que pour son fil iconographique. La couverture du numéro est d'une excellente qualité. Donc Faisal Garba, je vous laisserai la parole dans quelques minutes, le temps de présenter les autres intervenants, qui vont discuter votre présentation. Professeur Akosua Ampofo, qui vous êtes Professor of African and Gender Studies at the Institute of African Studies à l'University of Ghana. Vous êtes directrice et fondatrice du Centre d'études et de plaidoyer sur le genre de l'Université du Ghana. Et donc vous voyez aussi la dimension militante que je mentionnais dans la présentation. J'ai relevé comme publication de votre part en 2021 avec Joséphine Baker-Betts, Producing Inclusive Feminist Knowledge, Positionalities and Discourses in the Global South. Et nous avons également professeur Rachid Yassine, que je ne présente plus ici, donc qui est directeur adjoint du LASPAD, que je connais surtout comme ayant porté le projet BCS au LASPAD. Et donc, vous voyez encore une fois que eh bien, les thématiques que l'on mentionne sur les diasporas, le panafricanisme, etc., touchent notre laboratoire. Et je suis très content d'avoir ce panel. Et enfin, Fadilou Ndoye, vous êtes doctorant à l'UGB et à l'Université de Besançon. Vous travaillez.
Greetings, everyone. I guess I will say Nangadev. Okay, thank you very much to the organizers for the invitation, and congratulations to LASPAD and to Global Africa. I'm part of the Global Africa family. So I want to speak on a very contentious topic. And so the idea of Africa and its diaspora evokes all kinds of images, memories, but also present struggles. But questions of Pan-Africanism and decoloniality mean that we have to take seriously not just knowledge production, but the social use of knowledge, how we purpose knowledge. And the question of geopolitics, of course, means we have to take seriously what is happening in our sub-region today. So while the age of unipolar US hegemony is coming to an end, at least enslaved, and it was at the height of 19th century multipolarity that Africa was carved out at the Congo Conference of 1884 and 1885 in Berlin. So this is my primary thesis, that what we are experiencing today is not simply the beginning of the death of a hegemon, but also we are experiencing the rise of inter-imperialist competition manifested by what Russia is doing, but also the spread of China on the African continent and the penetration of the Gulf states in different extractive sectors of Africa. So the present moment, I think, is shaped by a number of very alarming things that need concrete analysis. So we are moving from a liberal imperialism to an armed imperialism. Might is right, and this is represented by a coalition of right-wing international bloc, what some call a proto-fascist global order. Indeed, there are parallels between what we are seeing now and the rise of classical fascism. We are also witnessing the rolling back of hard-won rights by women, people of color, and here the African diaspora is central, in that you saw what happened recently with the attack on Somalis, you know, as quote-unquote garbage. We're also seeing the breakdown of the global liberal hegemony and the valorization of strong men and coups. So many European countries say they are moving away from development aid to investment and all kinds of extractivist orientation around investment. And of course, attacks on key instruments of the multilateral liberal order. So the Refugee Convention is being renegotiated. Climate change, forget about it. Trump says this is a joke. The WHO is under attack. But also we are seeing a deepening of concentric disadvantages and inequality. As we know, Africa is the most unequal region of the world. So 23 of the 25 most unequal countries in the world are in Africa. And if you take it along the gender axis, in Africa, men own as much as 3 times what women own in terms of asset and income ownership. So this widening inequality also means a certain code against anything to do with minority and women's rights, and an assault of anything that has to do with blackness in the global political economy. And we see this through the mobilization of far-right rhetoric to preserve a certain world order where people like us always have to be down there. And this is accompanied by a denial of inequality, such as gendered inequality, but also the demonization of any alternative ways of being in the present world. Now, this is further complicated by conflicts and insecurity in our part of the world and what many call the new scramble for Africa. We're seeing an extension of inter-imperialist armed conflict in our sub-region, right? So we know at some point the Ukrainians were said to have provided certain information in the Sahel that will lead to attacking Russian forces. So obviously what is happening in that part of the world has expanded here, not just as a theater of war, but as a site of accumulation. So Africa is a major frontier of growth in the context of this inter-imperialist rivalry. Africa's mineral wealth, especially its rare earth minerals, serve as a leverage, but also the source of further extroversion and economic disarticulation. So all these powers are interested in what they can get. If you remember only recently, Niger had some arrangement with Turkey around exploration of minerals. Instrumentalization of migration serves to mobilize a constituency globally, but in particular in these heartlands of the contemporary far right. So we live a paradox where there's a great deal of demand for African labor across Europe, North America, but in the Gulf, but also a pervasive demonization of African migration, including on the African continent. So from South Africa to Ghana to parts of North Africa, the image, the specter of the African migrant serves not just to mobilize vote, but to create an in-group relative to the outsider. This is dramatized in very interesting ways. So the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is supposed to be the vehicle that ensures an integrated economy on the continent. Now, almost every country on the continent has signed up to the AFCTA. Now, the idea is if you have the AFCTA, you then need trade, but also people who connect the continent through small-scale trade. But only 4 countries have ratified the Protocol on Free Movement, right? And these include Sao Tome and Principe, Niger, Guinea, and Rwanda. So in a sense, even on the African continent, the idea of mobility is frowned upon, but the movement of capital, which in our own context is largely movement of multinational capital using local sites as clones. Now, how does the African diaspora feature in all this? Now, I propose, if you like, a schema of thinking of the African diaspora in 3 scales based on timeline. If we think of the trans-Saharan trade, but the movements towards Arabia and India, the truth trade and search for knowledge, we may have, including during that moment of the transatlantic, sorry, let's just wait for this thing. Okay, so including the transatlantic slave trade, I think constitute what one would call the first African diaspora in terms of volume, but also the spread of people of African descent. Now, this first African diaspora is complemented, if you think of just before the Moro of independence, the movement of African scholars to North America, to Europe. You know, you think of your Senghor, your Nkrumah, all those people who had to go in search of knowledge and met to form political communities around North America and Europe. Now, we also have the third African diaspora, which I think was spurned by structural adjustment programs. If you think of the desecration of the public sector on the continent, the idea of retrenchment of the public sector as a conditionality for federal loans. Now, this movement created a global spread, but also consciousness of Africans across Africa, Latin America, Europe, and North America. While the first African diaspora was connected to the continent by memory and resistance, Pan-Africanism served as the conscious political project that glued that diaspora. From the Pan-African congresses and the solidarities that were anchored around the anti-colonial, civil rights, and anti-imperial struggle, this diaspora was firmly political. This diaspora saw itself as part of a struggle to liberate not just the African continent, but the world. There was a certain world making to this notion of liberation. It wasn't parochial. The second African diaspora was largely professional and often returned to Africa or maintained a dual existence. If you think of post-colonial scholars, you know, who would spend 1 semester somewhere in North America, another semester on the African continent. The third African diaspora, on the other hand, is incredibly diverse, both in terms of its class makeup, gender, but also its political projects. It has spawned all kinds of solidarities, but also tensions. If you think of the pro-Palestinian activism in the North, a lot of it was carried on by Africans in the diaspora who understood oppression and dispossession not as a zero-sum game, but something that was additive. Yet, this diaspora can also be identitarian in terms of conceiving itself in narrow nationalist frames. So some of them will say, you know, I'm not an African American, I'm an Ethiopian American. But this was alien in terms of the way in which the first African diaspora conceived of itself, because it saw these borders as not just artificial, but unhelpful in building solidarities. Now, the decolonial question for me, I want to think of it around producing but also purposing knowledge for social transformation. So, one rider, I'm not talking of knowledge production in an instrumentalist sense, but I'm talking about knowledge production which is grounded, which is attuned to the social question around it. The decolonial imperative, I think, works on two conjoined legs, the intellectual and the practical and habitual dimensions. I want to focus on the latter, given the need for some practical steps in confronting the existential geopolitical and global political and economic challenges of our time. So taking seriously intellectual formations and the need for an openness to basic questions, but also to questions that are socially relevant. So an organic scholarship which is based on producing original knowledge, but knowledge that is anchored in something socially transformative. So I want to ask some open-ended questions in the hope that they can inform our discussions. What is the role of knowledge production in Africa? And how can such knowledge be purposed for social transformation? Partly due to the peopling of Africa, characterized by the exchange of ideas, goods, and communities, Africa, depending on how one delimits it, is a long-standing economic, political, and knowledge confluence. Accordingly, any history of, say, the production and trade in cola nuts, salt, or gold necessarily has to take West Africa as a confluence, as a unit. Or if you want to understand the economic history of South Africa, it is simply impossible to do so outside of framing Southern Africa as a unit. If you think of the ecological, cultural, and educational linkages that crisscross Africa, from the Ajami institutions that expanded literacy and cultures to the market women and fisher folk that provided and continue to provide livelihood, Africa was long before any of these sub-regions, ECOWAS, SADC, EAC, a confluence of being, knowing, and trading. Some of the earliest systematic knowledge production on these linkages first emerged in the works of anti-colonial and nationalist thinkers who identified and organized themselves as Pan-African. While each colonial territory had a national independence movement, they thought and produced liberation ideas as Africans writ large. Accordingly, such early scholarly movements as the West African Pilot produced knowledge for independence of Africa, not as individual colonized territories. Faced with increasing dwindling support for research by states across the continent, our institutions tilted from this conception of Africa as a continent, from this conception of liberatory knowledge, to conceiving of themselves as receptacles of ideas, but also funding from elsewhere. So, for example, in some instances, it can become a liability to have Africa as your orientation. And I'm sure it is, for example, not prestigious for a Beninois scholar to spend a sabbatical in Sheikh Anta Diop when they could simply go to a third-rank French university. Now, the result of this is a disconnect between the priorities of ordinary Africans and intellectual production. Instead, most research is not only externally driven, the questions and the frames that inform this research is outwardly tilted. Speaking on the importance of knowledge in transforming the continent, the late Malawian political economist Tandika Mkandawire said, African leaders behave as if Africa is going to be transformed by the sheer force of ignorance. So no society can actually transform itself outside of a systematic attempt to understand itself in respect relative to the rest of the world and harness that knowledge in order to create societies that are viable. When I mean societies that are viable, societies that tackle the major questions such as inequality, which is one of the primary questions that we're facing today. Now, if we take contemporary geopolitics and its direction and what it means for African states, it means African societies have to take seriously the question of knowledge production in a collaborative fashion. So we have here in Dakar a successful, I think, example of an attempt at a continental level to create a body that supports research that speaks to continental priorities. You think of the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Dakar. The next set of issues I want to concentrate on is the youth question. So Africa has this youth bulge. In certain parts of the continent, actually, the under 30 population makes up over 70% of the total population. But even before the present demographic reality of a youth bulge, the intellectual and social consensus around the continent's future is the need for some form of structural transformation. One that requires industrialization, local beneficiation, sustainable job creation, and social enterprises. However, the gap between the consensus and state policy is reflected in African states' continuous pursuit of commodity dependence importation of basic necessities from food items to consumables. The generalized crisis of the 1970s and 80s led to a mass movement of people within the continent and other parts of the world and created these diasporic flows that often served as sources of livelihood on the continent. This came to be celebrated in some academic and policy circles, with some states effectively viewing migrants as a source of forex or development agents. More than 4 decades afterwards, the model of depending on migrants for development has not yielded the purported promise, while the question of social transformation remains unresolved. The teeming youth in many African societies see very little prospect of meeting their aspirations locally, thus the deadly journeys across the Sahara and the high seas. As a response to this reality, the governments of Kenya, Ethiopia, and Ghana have turned to jobs abroad as a panacea. Young people are promised jobs in Asia, the Gulf, and parts of Europe that are facing demographic crisis. But the humanization of workers aside, these schemes effectively sidestep the question of structural transformation and fails to learn the lessons of previous ongoing experiments with that model in other parts of the world. With the dominance of the service sector and its particular financial arm, the deindustrialization of the continent has not only deepened primary export dependence, it has also created a condition of hopelessness for many young people on the continent. So what is to be done? I thought because we are dealing with a concrete question, we should not just remain at the level of diagnosing the issues, we should try and think of some concrete pathways forward. Now, the question of African leadership is a major one. Only a few days ago in Benin, there was an attempt to do something that has become quite common in this part of the continent. So if you think of our regional economic units, the African Union reform agenda really hasn't gone far. At the same time, we are busy constructing models using the European Union as a benchmark. The demographic question and what it means does not seriously inform the way in which you conceive of a future. And here I want to propose that if we are rethinking Pan-Africanism, it's important to anchor it on global realities and concrete situations and concrete social questions on our continent. And I want to propose that we begin to again think of Pan-Africanism by centering imperialism. Because classical Pan-Africanism was a direct resistance to and a challenge to imperialism, capital exploitation, dehumanization, and domination. So if we reframe Pan-Africanism and solidarity, then we begin to think of anti-imperialism not as some abstract question, but a concrete living reality where we have an enclavist economy that has very little linkage to the rest of the real economy, but to supply chains outside of the continent. And therefore, we have to face some honest questions. I know some young people people of my generation are very excited about what is happening in the Sahel. I'm not too excited because I'm not sure that we can do Pan-Africanism by distancing from Western French imperialism only to maintain commodity dependence via Russia, Turkey, and the Gulf states. And here I want to take a minute to explain what I understand by imperialism. If we see imperialism as an upscaling of capitalist competition, then imperialism necessarily creates this attempt by new entrants to dislodge those that had access to the pie. So if we are supposed to be truly Pan-African and claim sovereignty, Silas, then we have to be opposed to any form of domination, irrespective of where it comes from. But that also means that we have to ask ourselves the question, how different is what we are seeing in the Sahel from extractivism? And under what conditions would an assertive Pan-Africanism that is also anti-imperial stand? And how do we move beyond reactive mode to a programmatic Pan-Africanism? Now, if there's a degree of enclavism in the structure of African economies that combine local, regional, and global capitalist interests, then there's an aspect of enclavism that breaks up territories. We can illustrate this by taking some frontiers in the present structure of our broad political economy. The construction, for example, of pipelines means that people are likely to be cleared of territories, and often when these happen, these people are said to be the collateral damage of development. But I want to propose something that has been exercising my mind lately. The idea of the common management of the commons. The reassertion of the commons not just as a basis for viable and sustainable economic livelihoods, but as a basis for political self-management. as the basis on which different communities with different resources can network on the basis of their complementarity. The commons therefore cuts across different aspects. They extend to public goods like water, land, and the notion of common ownership, and therefore encompasses the working class, the urban poor, and women that are often marginalized. Common ownership combines public coordination at the most central level and diffusion to the more localized level, and then vice versa from the local to the central. Struggle over localized commons can generate systematic effects. For example, recently students in Madagascar were struggling against water shortage and erratic electricity supply, teamed up with workers, and began raising broad questions about the character of the polity and the political economy. Their target initially, of course, was the water workers and electricity workers whom they felt were inefficient. But before time, they came to understand that they had erratic supply of water and electricity because different components of the water and electricity supply chain had been commercialized and privatized. So this carving out of sectors of public utilities for private profits means hikes in tariffs, discontent, and of course, a clear example of our choiceless democracies. The consequent constant disinvestment and curtailing of revenue to the public because of internal privatization means that over time, the utility itself becomes more and more commercialized with no new investment and no new technology. The only way to generate further returns after giving away large portions of direct earnings to big political and private cartels is by increasing tariffs and squeezing workers furthermore. The workers in Madagascar were opposed to both the process of commercialization and the process of outsourced privatization. This immediately created an alliance between the students and the workers, and this could be extended, if we think of it, to the urban poor, but to nationally and regionally. Now, the point here is the need to think more in terms of movements, in terms of social movements, not NGOs. I want to emphasize that the struggle has to be thought of in terms of a bottom-up approach. If you think of NSAS, Occupy Ghana, the struggle of young people in Togo, Cameroon, etc., they may be national in character, but they are continental in ambition and essence. Finally, I think I have less than 5 minutes. If we think of the commons as a basis of meaningful participatory governance in a turbulent world, what is it likely to look like? The foregoing require the conscious mobilization of human, financial, and intellectual resources. For example, public financing has to be key driver of any far-reaching innovation in Africa. An important source of such a public finance is common resources like pension funds. These are already mobilized for private capital accumulation in the service of external and internal interests. Another template is the use of common assets where land, for example, is pooled for village level and town level development across borders, not in a fragmented sectional way, but on the basis of inclusive collective organizing. This takes seriously the material dimensions of what the late Ghanaian philosopher Kwesi Wiredu calls consensual democracy. And here I want to add the idea of a deliberative development. This means moving away from catch-up development to human flourishing as defined by communities through consensus building. The question of leadership is central in this case, especially the allocation of resources at the local level. Neoliberalism is corrupting the leeway in traditional social organization. No small number of chiefs are involved in destructive mining, equity funds, and all kinds of vehicles that characterize the current expansion of capitalism in Africa. Because of the need for natural resources, chiefs have shares in private equities and all kinds of bonds. It is impossible to think of meaningful democracy of citizens where some are subjects with differential rights in a sliding scale. It does not mean that one does not own, for example, land in a certain place, but you can have access to land on the basis of residency and historical association, not on the notion of some ethnicity or narrow belonging. To conclude, this project necessarily has to involve the negation of the core aspect of neoliberalism, which is against any idea of public ownership and national ownership, because neoliberalism views it as illegitimate. But in a context of great inequality, we need public coordinating institutions that can be reduced to market competition. On the basis of this, and acting in the current multipolar moment of inter-imperialist rivalries and aspiring sub-imperialist ambition, we have to anchor any idea of transformation on the notion of redistribution, the normal functioning of the global political economy, even when it does not intend to, is unequal. It is unequal in deep ways, given our political ecology and our political economy. Thank you very much.
Merci, professeur Garba, pour votre très stimulante présentation, extrêmement dense. Je crois que les traducteurs sont en sueur maintenant et donc peut-être que je vais demander aux participants, aux discutants, tout en respectant bien sûr le temps, merci, tout en respectant le temps, de ne pas hésiter à prendre le temps de bien formuler vos questions pour que la traduction puisse suivre également. Professeur Garba, je retiens, alors vous avez fait une présentation extrêmement complète, je retiens peut-être deux aspects qui pourront enrichir la discussion, hein, ces deux propositions. Sur les contradictions, vous avez soulevé énormément de contradictions auxquelles on insiste aujourd'hui, et d'ailleurs c'est un constat presque sans appel que vous avez fait sur la situation actuelle, contradiction entre la célébration de l'irruption de nouveaux acteurs en Afrique aujourd'hui, mais qui finalement rappelle aussi quelques autres moments de l'histoire où notamment les puissances européennes s'impliquaient sur le continent. Donc première contradiction. Deuxième contradiction aussi sur la ZLECAf, AFC-FTA, la zone de libre-échange en Afrique où vous... Je vais laisser passer l'avion. Donc la zone de libre-échange en Afrique, où vous rappeliez que la plupart des États du continent ont signé cet accord, mais très peu se sont mis d'accord pour la libre mobilité des personnes. Donc premier aspect, voilà, quelques contradictions tout à fait contemporaines, mais également je retiens votre appel à avoir une approche empirique des choses, à ne pas se satisfaire de débats théoriques un petit peu surplombants, et vraiment à s'ancrer dans les réalités du continent à partir d'exemples très concrets, et vous l'avez fait dans votre présentation et je vous en remercie, quitte à ensuite avoir une approche pourquoi pas plus militante. Donc je laisse la parole à la première discutante, professeur Akosua Ampofo, si vous voulez discuter la présentation de Faisal Garba. La parole est à vous.
Merci beaucoup. I'm not going to, the young people have a saying, and they will say what he said. In other words, he said it all, and one approves of it 100%. So Faisal, what I do want to do, because I have to speak, right, is to signal some of the things he said, and then to respond to one particular area that sits heavy on my own heart. So Faisal has talked to us about the unstable, multipolar moment that we are in, inter-imperialist as it is. And in that context, when people cry about the loss of multilateralism, a lot of the time, what they're really crying about is the loss of their own location in a particular imperialist space. They are not really thinking about the multi and all of us living together. Faisal talks about liberal imperialism to armed imperialism. And so the people who are losing out in the multilateralism are worried about the armed imperialism that's excluding them. He talks about rolling back of rights of various peoples and a global liberal hegemony, the valorization of strong men, and we find this global liberal hegemony also very sharply in the knowledge production industry, because it is a multi-billion dollar industry. And just to make a footnote here about publications and how much money the coalitions of publishers, because now they are also coming together in smaller groupings of larger how do I put it? A few small publishing houses have swallowed up the erstwhile ones we had, and they are multi-billion-dollar industry. Okay, but we cannot go there right now. So basically, Faisal has mapped out a certain poly-crisis for us and the African diaspora and its contradictions within that poly-crisis. But he also flags for us the social use of knowledge and the potential of the social use of knowledge. And I have, and I'm constantly in the moment I'm living right now, asserting, as I lean on the work of a lot of feminist scholars, for example, the Kenyan Wangari Maathai, the Ghanaian theologian Abba Oduyoye, to the African-American Angela Davis, that we have to reimagine our future in order to walk to that future. And I think Faisal has done some of that today so that we can reactivate solidarity. And that's a word that is embedded in what Faisal is talking about, even if he didn't use that particular word that much. We have to see our lives as conjoined, and we have to do it intentionally. And for those of you who have watched the Wakanda film, what's the title? Anyway, you all know the film about Wakanda. I'm forgetting the title of the film, but you know Wakanda, Black Panther, there we go. And they have vibranium, and they have to protect their vibranium. But if we lived in a world of solidarity, we would all be sharing the vibranium. So in the intellectual approaches to the crisis of the current moment, wow, okay, our knowledge must count for something. And yet, when people are crushed and hurting, they need to see that knowledge in action. So anyway, okay, 2 minutes. Faisal centers the youth and talks about the youth bulge. And yet there's a lot of silencing, exclusion, exploitation, and appropriation of the youth. And you mentioned some statistics. The highest rate of suicide in the world right now is in the so-called developing world, according to WHO. So Faisal asked us, what would collective regional agency look like in this context? And under what conditions would an assertive Pan-Africanism and anti-imperialism really stand? And he has some suggestions about in the knowledge sector. He talks about a funded scholar mobility program, a student exchange program. And in my recent conversations with students, they are very frustrated with a positivist approach to knowledge production. It's like, how does that affect the price of acheke or kinke or chapati, right? So we need to, whilst some people are still going with the fear factor and dividing us, we need to work with the willing. Forget about those who don't want to work. We can cry till the cows come home, they may not come. We need to work with the willing. We need to work for those who cannot speak. We need to remember that little drops of water can make a mighty ocean. We need to reactivate an understanding and appreciation of working towards the commons that Faisal talks about as a movement, and enable people to see that strategic value in the collective. You talked about Wuredu, the spirit of Ubuntu. We can distill that spirit. I don't have the time, but we can distill that spirit to understanding of our common humanity from a strategic perspective. If we don't all have clean air, we will all die. It's a simple fact, right? And so what about if we created a common handbook for our students called Curating Solidarity and the Commons 101? Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. Je vais essayer d'être synthétique parce que déjà beaucoup d'entre nous sont allés déjeuner et j'imagine que ceux qui restent aussi doivent avoir faim et qu'on n'a pas beaucoup de temps et c'est très frustrant. Et j'ai beaucoup apprécié votre intervention, Faisal Garba. J'ai lu le texte que j'ai reçu et il y a pas mal d'éléments de discussion. Il est dense, il est riche, il y a beaucoup de choses. Alors, je vais vraiment focaliser sur la dimension géopolitique du propos. Les questions autour les questions de mœurs, sur le masculinisme. Il y a une critique que je voudrais nous adresser à nous autres universitaires africains. C'est celle de cette espèce d'injonction démocratique à laquelle nous nous livrons systématiquement. Et j'ai pas l'impression, et peut-être que certains me dédiront, que dans les grandes puissances aujourd'hui, cette injonction démocratique qui fait cas systématiquement d'un appel au petit peuple, aux communautés locales, etc., et qui déresponsabilise ou qui dédouane d'une certaine manière les élites économiques et politiques africaines de leurs responsabilités, justement politiques et géopolitiques, sur le destin en cours du continent. Et vous faites bien de rappeler, donc c'est cette tension en fait un petit peu qu'il y a dans votre propos entre le recours à cette force populaire réelle, incontestable, le dynamisme des sociétés civiles africaines et des peuples, mais ce n'est pas de leur responsabilité. J'entends pas aux États-Unis, en Amérique du Nord ou en Europe un discours des universitaires qui fait appel systématiquement aux peuples, aux communautés locales, etc., sur des questions de géostratégie. Je vais prendre deux exemples très concrets. La question de la dédollarisation de l'économie mondiale en cours. Que dit l'Afrique? Que propose l'Afrique? Comment réagit l'Afrique à cette dédollarisation en cours d'hyperpuissances qui effectivement vont, pour reprendre un terme que Nadine a évoqué de remembrement du continent, de démembrement du continent aujourd'hui, et qui fait écho à ce que vous disiez tout à l'heure, que ce multilatéralisme, cette multipolarité géopolitique, eh bien, fait écho justement aux conditions historiques de l'esclavage, de la colonisation, qu'on a l'impression de revivre avec des nouveaux impérialismes en cours. Première question, premier cas d'illustration en fait, vous interrogez justement sur que peut faire le peuple face à la dédollarisation de l'économie mondiale et les communautés locales. Et deuxième question, c'est celle de la sécurité et de la privatisation de la sécurité en l'occurrence. Je fais écho par exemple à de grosses multinationales comme Palantir et même d'ailleurs le Nigeria a un projet équivalent de créer le Palantir africain qui permettrait à travers l'intelligence artificielle d'alimenter et d'aider donc les armées du monde puis les industries diverses et variées. Mais c'est vrai que ça fait écho aussi déjà à Blackwater à l'époque, qui s'appelle d'ailleurs aujourd'hui Academy. C'est intéressant de voir leur nouvelle dénomination. Ça fait écho aussi au groupe Wagner, etc. Et comment est-ce que effectivement cette privatisation de la sécurité, l'Afrique ne s'en donne pas les moyens aussi si les États ne sont pas capables d'assurer la sécurité géopolitique du continent. Je m'arrêterai sur ces deux exemples. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, professeur Rachid. Et allez-y, Fadilou, donc pendant 5 minutes. Allez-y.
Merci à vous. Merci pour la qualité de la présentation. Moi, je vais juste revenir sur un point un peu particulier. Vous avez mentionné que les États africains pourraient tirer des expériences sur le Mercosur, sur la mobilité étudiante, comme Erasmus, par exemple. En lien avec la décolonialité, vous avez également évoqué que les structures que les États africains devraient mettre en place devraient s'inspirer normalement de leur environnement immédiat, comme par exemple la mobilisation de la démocratie consensuelle ou d'une organisation sociale traditionnelle. Si je me réfère au keynote que vous nous avez transmis. Mais est-ce qu'à partir de ce moment-là, on ne va pas encore recouper des schémas comme celui de l'Union européenne, par exemple, si on se situe sur cette perspective-là? Et vous avez également fait mention d'une nécessité d'une gestion commune des biens communs. Là également, est-ce que c'est principalement sur le terrain de la décolonialité qu'on se situe? Les autres réflexions que j'avais portaient principalement sur la mobilisation de la diaspora et du panafricanisme comme thème. Je vais l'envisager comme un élément de politique étrangère de la plupart des États africains. Si l'on prend aujourd'hui l'exemple du Sénégal, déjà sous Léopold Sédar Senghor, avec le thème de la négritude, il y avait un élargissement de la focale vers les Amériques qui était déjà en vigueur avec Haïti, qui était priorisé dans le cadre de ces relations, même si dans son optique, il estimait que l'Égypte devrait être la mère de l'Afrique, l'Éthiopie, le haut lieu de la conscience africaine. Mais au travers des initiatives sénégalaises, il y aura une extension du groupe africain à l'Amérique latine et une adhésion de l'Haïti à l'accord Communauté européenne et ACP à l'époque. Avec le président Abdoulaye Wade, il y aura le renouvellement du thème de la Renaissance africaine, avec le point d'orgue des années 2010 et l'accueil des étudiants haïtiens au Sénégal, faisant suite au tremblement de terre qui s'était déroulé sur ce pays. Il y avait même une proposition assez audacieuse de sa part de conférer toute une région du Sénégal à la communauté haïtienne, toujours dans la thématique de la Renaissance africaine. Récemment, au niveau du Bénin, il y a eu le levier juridique qui a été actionné avec la délivrance de la nationalité à des ressortissants ou encore des descendants d'Afro-Américains. L'artiste américaine Ciara a justement été l'une de ses premières bénéficiaires. Le Kenya, à travers le déploiement d'unités de police au titre de la force de répression des gangs. Également, concernant le panafricanisme, on note de plus en plus une usurpation de cette thématique. Pour reprendre Hamzat Boukari Yabara, c'est un peu une notion qui est fourre-tout. On a tendance à l'amalgamer ou encore à le confondre avec le souverainisme ou encore une logique d'exclusion. Si on se situe toujours sur le terrain du continent africain, la plupart des textes constitutionnels consacrent dans leur constitution le thème de l'unité africaine. Et on a tendance à confondre les deux expressions. Par exemple, concernant le Sénégal, le préambule de la Constitution fait mention de l'unité africaine. L'article 37 de la Constitution relatif au serment du président de la République mentionne que le président ne ménagera aucun effort pour la réalisation de l'unité africaine. Et l'article 96 de notre texte constitutionnel dispose que le Sénégal s'engagera à coopérer avec tout État africain avec conséquences, abandon de souveraineté.
Merci Fadilou. Merci beaucoup Fadilou pour ta question. Professeur Faisal Garba, allez-y. Donc vous avez eu plusieurs questions. Donc je vous laisse la parole.
Thank you very much to the interlocutors for kind of engaging the paper seriously. To be honest, I only picked up aspects of some of the French contributions, so I will try and do fill in the gaps. When I was in primary school, there's something called fill in the gaps. You just okay. So, Prof, I think we have to work on that project, the book. And thank you very much. I think this is a largely accurate reflection of what I tried to do. So, Rashid, I completely agree with you, and I think the point that you made, I think, ties in neatly with Nadine's panel in the morning. You know, this question of the gap between popular aspirations and elite projects, right? Now, my own contention is that that does not mean we need less democracy, but we need more democracy. And I think we need to historicize democracy, right? Liberal democracy is a particular form of democracy. And even the liberal form of democracy was not conceded by the ruling class in Europe. You know, ordinary people had to fight for it. And there's a sense in which in the colonial moment, you had this narrowing of the public sphere, right? Where you had an attempt to create an ideological diversity around political society, but then social movements, you know, were clamped down. So in British West Africa, for example, you had the registrar of companies who will proscribe or register different social movements depending on their goals. And when they challenge the basis of the colonial authority and the power of the local landed elites that had chiefly ruled. So I think this an important point. And I want to come to that point about kind of de-dollarization, the attempts at ECHO and so on. So this point about sovereignty, you know, has been made a number of times. But I think part of the idea of a Pan-Africanist project is not to think of sovereignty in a narrow territorial kind of fashion, but sovereignty in terms of the content of livelihood, right? Sovereignty in terms of people's space to organize and define a future for themselves. And I think if you take US hegemony through the dollar, yes, that projects a certain imperial face and so on, but that does not necessarily inure to the benefit of, say, some worker in the US. Of course, they might have some vicarious benefit from it. The point that I'm trying to make is that if we upscale these questions around opening the public sphere, access to a democratized economy, right, then the idea of an alternative would also have to have a certain internationalist dimension, right? So of course has to begin from a Pan-African footprint, because the point that I'm trying to make, and this is where I'm coming at, is that, you see, the Pan-Africanist project was global in its thinking, right? So when even the African Union, Organization of African Unity, with its kind of limitations, when the OAU was formed, there was a member of the OAU called the United Arab Republics. The United Arab Republics included Syria today, right? So there was this notion of a world making, right? And I think the idea of beginning from some form of firm economic justice, which is rooted in terms of mobilizing women, market people, unemployed youth, is important, so that we don't again fall back into this elite project. What is the African Union doing? What is the EU doing? But where are the nodes of alternatives? And how can this put pressure from the bottom up, you know, for some kind of alternative that could also connect to different parts of the world? I mean, the point about security, spot on. I was chatting with my friend from Niger this morning about how the idea of the security votes in Africa is that vote which is beyond parliamentary oversight, you know, because it's so important, right? But also that is when basic rights can be curtailed, right? That is the tool through which these new frontiers of economic penetration in Africa, you know, has been extended. So if you think of the activities of the United States in places like Ghana and Nigeria, there is this unmentioned military bases that exists, you know, where even the Ghanaian military does not have access, you know, to it. But the idea is that these are training, collective training programs. So there's no parliamentary oversight because this is national security, right? And if you think of the Sahelian state, it is the same thing, right? So you cannot raise questions around the activities of the Wagner group because this is about our national security, right? So I think the key thing is not just to raise these questions about national security, but to ask alternative questions about what is the guarantor of security. Is it armed forces and so on, or is really about building cohesive societies and dealing with those questions that tackle? So the whole thing about taking human security outside of this formulaic kind of arrangement, but digging deeper into what it means. So I'm really sorry, my bad. I'm not sure I got all your points, but I will again try and deal with what I think I got. So when I give the example of Mercosur, I was talking about, you see, there's a way in which we think of the decolonial project as kind of epistemic intervention only, but I think it's beyond that. It's also about infrastructures, institutions, connections. And I think Mercosur provides an interesting learning ground in that you have these countries who also have a colonial history like us, right? Who thought that it's possible to harmonize their educational system, not just at a bureaucratic level, but fundamentally about taking seriously their history, what produced them, and so on. So again, it's this openness, not some narrow Africanism which says that, you know, African solution for African problem does not mean autarky. It means relating with the world, pulling what is useful, okay? And especially those societies that have similar histories as us. And that's why I did not speak about the Bologna process. I spoke about Mercosur because I think it's more relevant for us. And then finally, the thing about conflating African unity with Pan-Africanism, if I got it correctly. That's true because you can have African unity of states. So let me give you one example, and I promise to end here. So essentially, if you think of our regional economic communities, they are actually products of what I would call open regionalism, right? So through the ACP, the Economic Partnership Agreement with EPAs and the ACP countries. Basically, the European Union actually funded some of these initiatives where you had harmonization of trade laws and so on. So the idea you pool a common market, for these multinationals to grab at a go. So that's a kind of unity from the top for the purposes of capital. So unity does not always mean Pan-Africanism, right? And that's why I emphasize the idea of bottom-up, people-to-people, social movements, so that we kind of see the dynamism coming from society and not some elite projects. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, professeur Garba. Très riche réponse, et je pense que ça peut clôturer cette conférence. Peut-être juste pour faire le lien avec aussi le congrès de l'AAPS qui se déroule en ce moment. Je retiens une de vos expressions. Hein. Vous dites le projet panafricain ne pense pas la souveraineté comme un territoire, mais vraiment comme vous avez dit livelihood. Et je pense que ça, c'est une citation très fanonienne en fait de Frantz Fanon, bien sûr. Et donc ça résonne avec les autres conférences qui se tiennent dans ces locaux ces 3 jours. Donc merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup, professeur Garba. Merci beaucoup aux 3 autres intervenants. C'était une conférence très riche. Je m'excuse auprès du public de ne pas avoir fait circuler le micro, mais je pense que vous allez aussi me remercier de vous libérer maintenant pour aller pouvoir déjeuner. Et on se retrouve d'ici 1 heure, un peu moins d'1 heure et demie pour essayer de reprendre un petit peu le temps qu'on a perdu. Merci beaucoup.
Tu m'as pas laissé trop de temps là. Oui, bah oui,